Great. Welcome everyone to our final summer virtual clinic with the Edmonton Ultimate Players Association. We've got Jenn and Alain here talking about zone defense and offense this week. I'm super excited about this one because there's been some pretty windy days this summer where this would have come in super handy. So take it away.
Thanks, Vicky. Yeah, so we're talking about lots about zone today. Zone's a pretty massive topic, so we are looking to, in this presentation, go over things like a bunch of general zone stuff that applies to pretty much any zones, and we're looking at a few specific examples that are very commonly used on defense, playing a typical zone that forces towards the sideline. There's also going to be one we're looking at forcing up the middle, and we're also going to be looking at playing zone from an offensive perspective. And we're hoping that this presentation can kind of establish a baseline of information knowledge for league players. So that's a lot easier for teams to go play zone. I know from my own experience at Edmonton, captaining teams, you always, whenever that first team you're up against throws a zone on you, it's always a bit of anxiety-inducing moment because it requires so much work to go through and explain all the zone to everybody, which isn't always, you're not always prepped for that. So hopefully this will help with that. And also for players who are a bit more on the competitive side, we'll be sharing a lot of information that I think will be helpful for players at pretty much any level. So with that, I will pass it over to Jenn to share your screen. I'll stop sharing mine and starting to talk about zone defense. There we go. Oh, Jenn's muted.
Sorry about that. We good now? Okay. So kind of a different approach to defense here. When you're playing a zone, one of the bigger misconceptions you get a lot with new players is you're not guarding anyone, but you still are guarding a player. It's just you might be one player, might be more than one, and those players are changing continuously. So it's whoever's coming in and out of that zone that you're designated to is who you're guarding. And then with zone defenses, you're trying to set up different scenarios where one offensive player might be covered by more than one defender. And then because you're putting yourself into those scenarios, you're also going to be leaving yourself with scenarios where you have that one defensive player that might have more than one offensive player to cover, or you might have offensive players being left open. So different reasons why you might play your zone. So if you've been playing your matchup or your person defense all game and it's just not working. So just giving the other team a different look. The weather could be really windy, rainy, etc. It might be tougher to get different types of throws off. Maybe your players aren't super fast. They can keep up with people in one-on-one matchups, but they are really strong in like space awareness and field awareness. Zones are really good to help disrupt any pull plays or set plays that the offense might have. And just another option to kind of slow them down in general. So instead of having that straight up opportunity to throw something upfield to someone, your different zone looks could throw those off and cause them to kind of rethink or take a second or third second to think about what they want to do with their offense. So with any typical zone defense, we've kind of split the roles into 3 different categories. And then depending on what kind of zone you play, those roles will then have like more specific positions within them. So the first one we're calling are the disc containers. So we're just saying they're the people that are kind of guarding the disc or the thrower most of the time. Then you'll have a line of defense in the middle of the field, which will be your mids. And then you will have a third line of defense on the deep end of the field, which we'll call your deep positions. And then on the other side of that in offense, similar to a matchup defense, we're saying you're going to have your handlers as your primary disc handler throwers. You'll have players within the midfield, and then you'll have players deep. And then just our legend for any diagrams we show. So yellow arrow is going to show our direction of play. Blue trapezoid is your defense. White X's are your offense. Yellow circles your disc, and then the dotted line is going to be your cutting direction. All right, so in the two examples we show, the defenses kind of have to stay within those blocks. So the defense I'm showing, you kind of have to play it all in one, similar with Al's, but then the offense, the positions can kind of be like mix and match between different strategies within your team. So you can kind of take what you want from there and decide what might work best for your team. All right. Can we see the new slide now?
No.
Did it change? No. There we go. Just figuring this out. Good now?
There we go.
Thank you. All right, so I'm going to talk about a 3-3-1 zone or a cup, which most people should be familiar with. It's kind of like the primary zone that most teams will go to if no one's played zone before. I'm going to try, instead of just giving the basics of it, to kind of give you a couple different things to think about in the positions you're in there. But in general, what a 3-3-1 zone will do is you're putting more pressure on the thrower because you have 3 people that are kind of guarding the disc, and then you're leaving other offensive players open, kind of giving them that option. So you're like 3 people are guarding the disc, taking away their throwing options, but then because of that, you have probably 2 other offensive players on the field that are being left open. All right. So for this one, our disc containers are going to be the cup. So with that cup, your main goal shouldn't be to get a hand block or a turnover. A lot of times you go in there and, like, if that's what you're really working towards, you're going to end up overcommitting to something and then leaving something that's going to be more of a detriment to your team. So if you really commit to try and get that hand block, you're probably making a big hole for them to throw somewhere else if you don't get that hand block. So you're kind of looking to just contain their throwing options. So the way the cup's set up, it's making this throw here look really appealing, saying, here, take this throw to the sideline. It's a great option. You should really take it. And then kind of taking anything to the break side to be something that the thrower's going to have to work a lot harder to get to. So they're really hoping that the thrower wants to take this look here. Terminology can vary greatly for this. So for this particular presentation, we're going to call the mark the person closest to the disc. The middle is the one in the middle of the cup, and then the tail is going to be the furthest from the mark. All right. So the mark is the leader of the cup. So putting someone in this position, you want to make sure that they're comfortable with the rules of stall counting. You can encounter marking violations somewhat frequently within your group here. So knowing how to react to double teams and contact calls and things like that is definitely important when you have your mark there. When you're in that position, you can kind of take into account like what angle you're marking at and not keeping it the same all the time. So for example, if the disc is on the break side here, you might want to mark a bit flatter because they don't really have anyone over here to throw to. Whereas if the disc is on this side here, you might want to make that mark a little more forcing towards the sideline because you want to make it even harder to throw back to the break side over here. Another thing to take into consideration is like the depth of your mark. So some throwers get super uncomfortable when a mark's right up in their face, but then other throwers are like, well, thank you for being so close. I'm just going to step around you. Where if you back off a bit more, if that thrower was really comfortable when you're close, that you can take away a lot more angles from a distance. So if you're marking and say the thrower's a bit taller than you, backing off a step or two can give you that extra time to react to the angles that they may be able to make it to because they have longer limbs there. So kind of going back to like how the mark is in charge there. So we see the mark moves a little bit there to cover up a throw to the break side. The middle and the tail then have to react to that as well. So with the middle, I find if you have a new player in your team, that's a really good position to put them in, because all they have to do is stay between the mark and the tail. So it's something where they can kind of react to a lot. And it's like, hey, I just need to make sure I'm between these two people here. So for someone who's brand new, it's something that's easy for them to be involved with, and they can learn pretty quickly, and they have those two people in both their ears to kind of talk to them too. If you have a more experienced team, you might want to consider putting someone with a bit of height in that position. If they're standing there with their arms up, that makes throwing over top of that cup is a lot tougher. And another thing to kind of play around with this, if you're in that middle position, think about like rotating your body in different directions. So you don't just need to stare at the disc. Your primary goal is to take this hole here away. So this space between you and the mark. So sometimes it might be more helpful to just turn around and see who might be sitting in that hole, and you can adjust your positioning then instead of just staring at the disc the whole time. All right, and then finally we have the tail. And they are responsible for this hole here between the middle and themselves. Kind of with this position, some things you can do that you maybe not have thought of is you can easily leave the cup without causing a huge detriment to it, especially like depending on where the position is. So say the disc is here, and if you have the mark flat and your mid is over here, you want the tail to maybe like jump up and get in the lane here to throw to the middle, or in a mid there as well. You're not creating a huge hole to the break side for the thrower to throw to. So if you find yourself in that tail position and you want to try something new, maybe like break off from the cup a little bit, float around and see what other like passing lanes you might be able to get into. All right. So as like I mentioned before, as the cup, you're kind of just looking to contain the disc. You're not necessarily looking for those hand blocks. So you're hoping the offense makes a lot of passes. The more passes they make, the bigger chance that they're going to make a little mistake on one. So with that being said, when a pass goes up, you're not necessarily looking to get to the disc as soon as possible. You're looking to contain the damage that's done by any continuing passes. So for example, if a pass goes to a sideline here, all right, you're going to be looking to kind of prevent passes to these players here or even through to here, as opposed to getting to the disc really quickly. So we watch the disc going over the side. We're going to see the players kind of move down to cover any upfield passes first, and then close in on the cup. So to show that again, they're going a bit wide first and then closing back in onto the cup. Because you kind of make this movement together, when you're farther away, you have that bigger reaction time. So if they do try and throw something through, you have a bit more time to react to it, instead of you all going closely together at the time you're covering less ground. Okay. All right, so one thing you see pretty frequently within playing against a zone is people crashing into the cup. Oh, sorry, we're going back to the other side now. So this is another example of it going to the other side. Again, cup is getting really wide first, looking to cut off players, passes to these players upfield, and then closing in on the disc. So when the pass first goes up, these players here are your threats. This player's not much of a threat with the disc. They're not going to be scoring from where they are. So that's what you want to look to first. All right, next one. So when you see, what we mean by someone crashing into the cup is an offensive player that's not the thrower comes into this area that the cup's covering. So for example, here we have one of the cutters that come in there. So what do we do about that? So your first option, just ignore it. Let them get that pass off. The stall count could be really low. In this position, you're giving the disc to a cutter who may not be as strong of a thrower. They're not gaining many yards. And then like any potential loss that might occur from someone leaving the cup to try and cover that is eliminated because you're just letting it go ahead. So that's your first option. But then you might decide as a team, nope, we're not going to take that option. We want to make that crash pass a challenge for them to get off. So we want to cover that player. So I've seen multiple teams take either this middle player or the tail to cover those crashes. So most often they will come from this side or through the cup. So the middle is usually closer, so they can get there a bit faster if they cover them. However, if the middle player covers, you're going to have a pretty big space here that they're leaving by moving out of the cup to cover that crash. And in general, any passes to the break side or upfield are going to hurt your team a lot more. So this is leaving a pretty damaging hole there. On the other side of things, you could have the tail come up and cover. And in that position, you're still leaving a hole here, but you also have your mid, that's not on the screen here, but they would be in this position here, and you have a tail or your deep covering that space as well. So yes, you are leaving kind of an upline throw, but that's something that's going to be a bit easier for the cup to catch up on if they have, and you have a bit more help on your side there as well. So I prefer to have the tail covered, but both have been done. One important thing to think about with crashes, I've heard people just say run and stand in front of the disc, you're allowed to double team. That is not true. You need to be actively guarding the player that's moving into the cup. If that brings you within 10 feet of the thrower, that's totally fine, but you can't stand and face the thrower and just try and get in their way. You have to actually actively be guarding that crash that's coming in. Cool. All right, moving on to our next line of defense, so the mids. So as I talked before, you are in a specific zone on the field, but you still have to find someone to cover. So if that means you have to leave your zone, you leave your zone to go cover someone, you just have to be a bit more alert to get back there before when someone does move into that zone. And another important thing within the mids is to be really loud and vocal talking to your cup, letting them know that people are coming into there, letting them know where the holes might be. So in addition to like actually covering defenders, you want to communicate to the rest. Again, for terminology for this, so we have our left mid or our force side. So their zone is the smallest compared to the three because it's typically where the disc is being funneled to. And you have your mid or your middle mid, and they have a zone that's a bit bigger than the left. And then finally your right mid or your break side mid. And they kind of have the biggest zone to cover because any passes typically going to that area are going to be over the top passes. So you have a bit more time to get there, but you also have a bit more ground to cover. So in general, what you're looking for in those positions is covering any holes that the cup may have left, looking to cover those secondary passes if a pass does get through the cup. And in general, you're not looking to ever cover the disc. So one thing you kind of have to look for with those mids is that constant decision making of like, is it worth it to make this bid to try and get a D here versus I'm covering the next pass to help my team out there. If the disc moved to the sideline here, your positions are going to change a bit. So you can see our mid is going to come over a bit and help cover this person here. And then our right side mid could move up in this area. And now you can kind of cover both this player here as well as this offside handler. Another option with this right side mid is to fill in the deep space here and help. So if there's another player deep there, they might be able to help those. Because they are farther away from the disc, that right side mid can play a bit farther from the offensive players. All right. And then similarly, if it goes back to the break side, that right side mid's now a bit closer. So they want to be able to guard players here a bit closer. Middle's got to get across here to be able to help. And then right side again, because you're the farthest from the disc, you can kind of put a bit more space between you and the offensive player there. So you might be able to jump up on this handler if a pass comes through, and then as well as both these defenders here. All right, so scenarios that happen when the mids a lot is choosing between those two players. So you kind of have to think about different things as like, okay, where's the bigger threat at? What has happened in the past? What's going to do, like, yeah, what's happened previously? What's the throwing level of both the players there? Different things like that. So one example would be the disc is on that force side sideline, and there's two different players on that sideline there. So as this left side mid, you need to choose between one or the other. So here, let's say you choose the closer one. That's a lot easier pass to complete. It's going to have a higher percentage rate, where a pass to this deeper player is less likely to be completed. You will also have your help of your deep defender, so they may be able to help you out with that deeper player as well. And then just like take into consideration, say the first time you take that shorter player and they make that pass that's easily caught by the deeper one, maybe next time you're like, okay, I'm going to take the deeper player and I'm going to give up that shorter pass, and just know that it's not going to be as much damage to your team. Again, the zone's kind of set up to be in position to create scenarios where you are guarding more than one player. So you have to make those decisions, and a good offense is going to be able to react to them and find the open players. So you can't just let that, like, get yourself down on that. Just be like, okay, they beat me that way this time. Next time you have to beat me a different way. Just another example for that one. And here, this scenario, this mid player has these two players to choose from. So again, you just have to pick one. So just kind of that floating in the middle and leaving them both open is kind of the worst thing you do. So in this scenario, you don't really have one that's going to be a significantly higher advantage to the offense where they got them. They're both kind of in the middle of the field. If one player's one that's like been catching the disc every second time, who's been throwing a lot of goals for the other team, maybe pick them. But this is another scenario where communication can be really valuable too. So if you're in that mid position and you know you have your right side mid here, you can just be like, hey, take this player, and then you can cover this one. Or similarly, you could talk to your left side mid or your deep back there, and they may be able to help you out with them. Some other scenarios that you may come into with the mids is those opportunities to poach on the handlers or guarding any cutters that are in that area. So for example, you could go here, this left side mid could choose to like pinch up on the handler here. As I kind of mentioned before, it's that risk reward thing, right? So if you get that D, you're in a great opportunity to transition really quickly. Your team can go, like, if you can get that run through D and go to the end zone and someone else picks up the disc, you're pretty open there. But if you miss it, that means that you're now on this side of the play and this whole space here is wide open. So in general, if you're going to make a play on a disc in a mid position, like, be more than 90% sure that you're going to get it in most cases. And if not, just look for that next pass. Right, and then last.
So Jen, before we move on, so you had mentioned a good spot to put a newer player in the cup, but now if you had a player that you need to place in the mids, is there a particular position that would be easier for them?
I find the left side is probably the easiest, just because you kind of always play just off the cup and you have the smallest zone to cover. I would say the mid is probably the hardest, because you have to be really aware of people constantly moving in and out of that zone. So yeah, I would say this spot here, because their zone is a bit smaller and there's almost always people in that space to cover. In general too, I would say, if you're not on the field with them, get them to play on the side that you're on, and then you could just help them out with that, right? Because it's really easy on the sideline to talk to a mid and just be like, hey, guard this person. So yeah, I would say either side is probably easier than the middle for a newer player, but I would lean towards the side you're forcing on.
Perfect, great.
And then they're also pretty engaged that way too, so they feel like they're contributing a bit more, as opposed to the break side if the teams aren't throwing it. Cool. All right, last one is deep. So with the deep, you have a pretty large area to cover, but things like bad weather and throwing ability and whatnot can shrink that area pretty significantly. So this is one that there's a lot of judgment calls that can go into playing where you position yourself. I know a lot of people always are like, well, we need to put our tallest person deep, but like, if the team hasn't completed a deep throw on you yet, what's the point of like wasting all your height somewhere that's not going to get any action with the disc, right? So kind of take some considerations into how the game is going before you think about what you're going to position there. So if I'm playing deep, I kind of like to let the deep throws go off until they start completing them consistently. If they make 1 out of 4, I'm good with that. If they start making 3 out of 4, that's going to be a bit more of a problem, right? So you can kind of look to just to let it go, and then you can pinch in a bit more to help out these players here. Oh, there we go. And then deep wise, you can always, so if they're completing 3 out of 4, if they're completing always to the same person, if you see that person in that zone, then you might want to work to cover them a bit more. Yeah, and then similar, you can move side to side. So a couple things with the zone trap. So like we said before with this, you're saying, here, go to this 4-side sideline. We really want you to go there. So once the players go there, how do you react to that? You want to make it really challenging for them to get off of that. So I'm just going to talk about a couple options for trapping there. All right. So the first one is just going to be wrapping. So like I mentioned before, the mark is the boss of the cup. So whatever they do, the other players have to react off of that. So if our mark rotates to try and take that backfield option away a bit more, the other 2 players in our cup need to adjust off of that. So right here, the cup is really saying, here, throw upfield. We're giving you lots of options to throw up there. So how our upfield defense is going to then help adjust from that is our 4-side or left side mid is going to kind of help fill in that space. So we've almost created like a 4-person cup here. So they're looking a bit more at guarding the disc as opposed to this player. And then the other 3 players on your team can move over and help as well. So your mid is kind of looking for any players that are maybe in holes through that cup. Your deep can come in as well, depending on where the other players are. And then this right side mid has a massive area to cover, but they're hoping for something over the top that takes a few seconds to get there that they can make up that ground. And then another option we have is I'm calling a no dump trap. So instead of wrapping, the mark is then going to turn and cover the closest handler there. So the one looking to make the primary dump cut. So to adjust off this, the middle of our cup is going to take over the mark. And then the tail of the cup is going to adjust to then make sure that they're covering this hole here between the middle and the tail. And then again, our mids need to adjust off of that. So our mid-mid is going to pinch over a bit to kind of cover this player. The left side mid can stay with this player, or they can come up here. It depends on what players are in that space. And then the deep's going to be playing a bit shallower as well. So this makes it a bit more challenging to get the disc off that sideline, because not only does the thrower need to throw a break throw around this mark here, the player they're typically going to look to throw to first is covered by a defender. So it makes it a bit more challenging to get that disc off the sideline. Then once it does get off, say it gets to this player, the mark's already there, you just fall back into your cup as you were and keep playing from there. So this is just a little video that shows what the 3-3-1 looks like in gameplay. I'm going to show this twice. First time I want you to all just watch the cup. So the disc is coming into play here. So just watch how they react to the disc moving, how they're kind of all moving as one unit, how they react to crashers. And then the second time through, I want you to keep an eye on the mids here. Kind of look at how they're adjusting their position, they're adjusting who they're guarding as the play goes on and people move in and out of the zones. Okay. Okay. Ooh. All right, and now this time, keep an eye on the mids. Okay. So if you saw a couple times there, ooh, where's my mouse at? I'm frozen right now. Great. Can you guys hear me at all?
Yeah, we can definitely hear you.
Okay. I'm just going to keep talking, but I can't really move my slide ahead right now. So hopefully it'll catch up soon. So with the left, or I guess it would be right side, the mid closest to us, and the mid there, you can see a lot of pointing and communicating back and forth between them. So they're kind of letting each other know, okay, I have 2 people in my zone right now. Can you take this one? Okay, there's only 1 person, I'm going to move back. and things like that. And then with the cup itself, you can see it kind of grows and shrinks depending on what players are in there. And as passes go off, it tends to initially grow first and then it shrinks back down. I think I have my screen back.
Yeah, and I think it's from the slide being silent, right? The video, it was silent.
Yeah.
In reality, if you were actually watching that game live, there would be a lot of shouting on both teams happening in a zone situation, right?
Yeah, and with the video itself, it's just commentary. You can't really hear the field play that much. This was CUC's last year. That was super, super windy.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, you couldn't hear too much from there. My screen is totally frozen. Al, do you want to just, sorry?
Why don't I try to share and it might knock you out of.
Yeah, I got nothing right now.
So in the meantime, for those of you folks who are watching, if you've got any questions, just type them into the group chat and I can read them out to our hosts. Any scenarios that you've encountered and you may want advice on, you know, how to work with that. And then also, you know, or just other topics related to zone that you may want Jenn or Al to cover.
I had one quick question since we were talking about where to put newer players. Jenn, where would, like, some of your, maybe your top player, where would your top player go?
It depends where their skill set is, but like I find the mid is kind of the most challenging position to play. Just as far as like you have like the people in and out of that zone are constantly changing. You need a lot of speed and quick reaction times to be in there. So it depends on like your top player is someone who's really quick, really good at reacting, put them there. If there's someone that's really good at like thinking about angles and things like that, really active on the mark, you might want to put them in that mark position. If they're a really aggressive player, putting them in that tail position on the cup might be helpful. If the other team is throwing deep against you and completing it pretty frequently, you might want to put them there. So it depends on where their skill set lies, right?
Very good. We can see your screen.
Okay.
The cup slide.
Oh, okay. I still have the video slide. Oh, my mouth moved a little bit there.
Yep. Yeah, I see the slide as well. You had mentioned in this scenario where the force is always on the same side of the field. So is there a preferred side? Like how would you make that decision off the line? Am I forcing home side or away side? And is that based on like what kind of criteria? Like whether like the wind is blowing home side, where would you want to force?
Sorry, I missed the first part of that. Are you asking like based on wind, what way to force?
Yeah, so like often if you're running off the line and you're ready to set your cup, right? So then you're committed to doing like a single mark or single four side mark. So you're always moving from one side to the other side.
Yeah.
And how do you decide which side that you're forcing towards?
You can do either. Oh, something's happening here. I've seen both work. I tend to like to force with the wind. So if it's blowing really hard towards the home side, I would force home. Reason being for that, if you get stuck on that sideline, on that home side sideline, any throws up there are going to be a lot harder for them to come back into the field of play when they come up. And then any break throws through the cup or around it are going to tend to float a bit more because they're going into the wind. So it gives you that little extra second of time to make a play on the disc. I think I have my screen back now.
I'm going to maybe just grab the screen from you for a second if you could share again, because I think it's stuck on my screen.
Okay.
So let me just try this. So then I'm just going to pop it to the whiteboard for a second. And then if you're able to grab it back, that'd be great.
I can't get into Zoom right now.
Oh no.
I have like the video of the four of us on the side and it's not opening.
Should I jump into mine?
Yeah, you go for it, Al.
Okay. Why don't I start up with a different kind of zone defense to play. Let's see here. Share my screen. So using a different kind of zone, you might do that for a few different reasons. One, from like a strategic perspective, just to keep the offense off guard. If they can't figure out what exactly the defense is doing, it may take them a few points to figure it out, and that can really give you a nice advantage. Basically means you're going to be scoring 3 or 4 points in a row there before they figure something out. So if you can switch up your zones a few times per game, and the offense doesn't know what you're doing, it's a big advantage. And the other reason you might want to play a different kind of zone is because your strengths as a team are better suited to a different kind of zone. So I'm going to show a forcing middle zone, which has some similarities to the traditional zone Jen just went over, especially in the mids and the deeps. The cup is really where the differences are. So let's see how it looks. So to go over the cup, we have a mark. We have what I'm calling the funnel. So what's happening here with these two people is they're really creating a funnel, blocking any passes towards either sideline and forcing the disc to go up through the middle. And then what we're going to do is we're going to put our third person in the cup right into the middle of that funnel to really put a lot of pressure on the thrower. Now, what that leaves for the thrower are these two throwing lanes, which is where we're going to place our wings in the midfield. So let's see, here our mids are here, right in those two throwing lanes. So we're sort of trying to cover everything here, while we're leaving we've got a bit of a mismatch downfield, 4 players against 3, where we have here, oh no, that doesn't make sense. So here we have our mid-mid who's going to cover the middle of the field. So similarly, we've got our wings covering the sides. Mid-mid's going to cover a big space in the middle here. And then, sorry, let's see here. To explain a bit more about what these players are doing, wings are shutting down these easy passes through the cup, of course. Now, what I mean by shutting down is basically what that means is you want to convince the thrower that this pass is going to get shut down. So whatever you need to do that convincing is what shutting down is. Usually it's just standing in the lane, but it's a bit open-ended in that way. And the mid-mid shuts down the middle, and needs to be quite quick because they have a pretty big area to cover. And in this particular zone where they have the top of the cup right in front of them, sort of, you want to play off of this person so that you're covering as much of the field as possible. So if this person's shifting to one side a little bit, then you as a mid might shift to the other side a little bit, and you're cutting down angles there. These wings are quite important for containment, as Jen was talking about. The deep is quite an important position. Primarily, of course, the number one job is not let any passes get completed deep, and that's the number one priority. The second priority for the deep is to be a communicator. So excellent communicators are good deeps. They're into the mids about players that are coming into your zone, so that they can pick them up and they're also, so they're kind of quarterbacking the communication quite a bit there. And then lastly, the deep can be effective at shrinking the field. So the closer to the disc, basically, that the deep can stand, the tighter all the throwing opportunities are here for the thrower. So the more you can convince whatever deep player is out here to push inwards, the better, more effective it's going to make everyone else, because there's less space to operate with. So if you can do all those three things, you'll be an excellent deep in a zone. I'm going to show, like I was showing, the containment from the wings, which is a really critical piece in a zone. Anytime a pass goes off, the wings and the mids and the cup, all 6 of these players are looking over their shoulders to see what the new throwing lanes are, and are getting into those lanes before getting back to their positions. So I think I have an animation here. Pass goes here. Let's focus on this wing here. They're going to adjust, as is the mid-mid, to cut off those 2 throwing lanes. And that gives the cup time to get over and reset the zone. So that happens after every pass. You contain the next one, cut off the next one, and get back into your position. One thing that is tricky about a zone is that there's going to be a point usually when you're going to switch out of the zone to a match defense, where you're going to pick up individual players. And so as a team, you're going to want to have like an understanding of what the signal is for that, so you're on the same page of when it's time to turn and find a person to match up with one-on-one. Here's an example of just everyone finding a person. And we'll see a little bit later that, although it wasn't so clear in this example, the person with the frisbee is the last person you want to worry about when you're doing this. So location is a huge part of this. What I like to do is point at the person I'm covering so that everyone else can see who I have. And if that way, whoever doesn't have a person can figure out who's left to cover. And then one more thing I want to talk about, which Jen touched on briefly, is what do you do if there's no one in your zone? We're looking at this wing here. Everyone's left their zone. What do they do now? So as Jen touched on, you are still responsible for that area. So you want to be listening to the deep and to the sideline, whether someone's coming into it, and to make sure you can get back there in time. And then beyond that, you have a free reign to sort of go get a D. And that brings up baiting. So baiting, we were talking about shutting down being trying to convince the thrower that a throw isn't going to work. Baiting is trying to convince the thrower that a throw is going to work, and then being able to get there to intercept it. So in this particular scenario, if you're the far side wing, you might be baiting a pass across the field to this handler. So you want to stand just far enough away that you can get there in time, so that the thrower thinks they can make that throw. Baiting throws is sort of what happens in a zone all throughout. You're containing, but you're also baiting. In the cup, I like to talk about the positioning in a standard cup and the gaps between. So it's not really applicable in this funnel situation, but more in a sideline forcing zone. The amount of gap you want to leave is a baiting amount of gap, so that the thrower thinks they can get it through there, but you can block it. And that's the right amount. And there's a bit of trial and error that goes along with that. So you'll have a gap open there, and they'll get through, and then you'll learn that the correct gap for that thrower is a little bit smaller.
And I think what one really interesting and important thing that you mentioned is that communication piece, right? That often on the field, we feel like we just need to rely on each other, but as players on the field, really get your sideline to help you and speak to you. So then instead of having to make that decision, how big a gap should I leave? Someone could be there coaching you, move more to the right, move more to the left. I think sometimes, especially when we're newer, people are afraid to add too much noise to the field and potentially confuse the players, right?
Right.
So it's good to know that, and or not speak up at all. So if you're don't know where to go, get someone to tell you.
Yeah, communication takes practice in Ultimate. So I'm always encouraging people to speak up, even if they say something completely foolish. It takes practice to sort of find that voice, and you'll figure out the right thing to say eventually. And yeah, for beginner players about where to go, and for more experienced players, once they already know where to go, the communication really is important, as it lets them really focus on what's going on the field, particularly on the thrower, so that they can react quickly once something happens and they still know where the players are around them.
And I've even had situations where, like, I was on a team where you're assigned a person on the sideline whose job is just to help you. So then you just have to listen to that one voice as your kind of buddy, your extra set of eyes, and that will kind of help cut out the cacophony of all the other voices.
Mm-hmm. That's a really good structure for a team to have, yeah, where you're working with someone that you're not usually on the field with, and you can build that communication relationship that just gets better and better as the season goes along. Here now are a couple ways that you can adjust this zone based on the number of players on the field and still have some fun and have it potentially be effective and potentially not, but worth experimenting with. So if you're in a 5-on-5 situation, you're going to keep the funnel cup forcing the middle, but then the other two players are going to play sort of the role of the wings and mid and deep all in one. They're going to be splitting the field sort of down the middle, so that this person is going to be covering sort of this whole space, and this person this whole space. Now, this puts a good amount of pressure on the thrower. And you're not going to necessarily get it for every pass, but the hope is that you make the defense throw enough passes that eventually they're going to turn it over before they get to the end zone. In the case where this might be a lot more difficult with this structure, is if the third handler moves up the field. So now you got 3 offensive players downfield with 2 defenders, and 3 on 1 here, cutting off. You got 1 cutting off this row. This player, although they're the mark, they aren't really taking any throw away. So there's a bit of redundancy there. So you may be able to say it. Well, it does put a lot of pressure on the thrower, so it may be effective still. It may not work that well if you're up against some pretty good throwers. Worth trying. And then in a 4-on-4 setting where there's usually a much smaller field too, so what you want to do is really force high floaty throws. So you'll have the funnel and sort of a rover who is just going to play a bit of containment until contain until that opportunity comes where they can pounce and grab the disc, that high floaty disc. Depending on the amount of space in your field, this could be a pretty tough zone for the defense, but you never know. Like we were saying, getting that the offense at a rhythm, showing them something unexpected often generates a turn just on its own. So now we're gonna, let me just
So Jen, maybe I can, let's see if I can flip you back to your slides. Oh, maybe not.
Oh, I don't have my share on.
Oh, okay.
Uh,
I think you wanted to go over the first sideline 5-player variation, right?
yeah, just to kind of play off Al's there. Kind of good timing of me getting frozen right as I finished up the 7-on-7.
Oh, technology. But it's good to kind of see that 5-on-5 because I know, especially with the current cohort sizes that we're limited to, we're playing a lot more 5-on-5 than we normally would be. So This is good news.
Are we on my screen now?
Yeah.
We are.
Okay, perfect. Yeah, so this kind of has a similar transition from 7-on-7 to 5-on-5 as the funnel Al showed. So with this one, we're going to lose the tail of our cup and our mid-mid. So our cup now just has 2 people. So unfortunately, that means you're taking away fewer throwing angles from the thrower, but you're still putting a bit more pressure on them. And then these mids here now kind of have a bit bigger zone to cover. So you're kind of covering like the mid and your side as well. So if the disc is in the middle, you kind of have those flat ones. If the disc comes over to the sideline here, this left mid has a pretty small zone, but then the right mid zone gets a lot bigger. And then similarly, if the disc is on the other sideline, and then the roll of the deep kind of stays the same. So this one could work pretty well, especially with smaller size fields. As the field gets bigger, the advantage gets more and more towards the offense, and that can cause a whole lot of running for a 5-on-5 scenario. So another option I was coming up with 5-on-5, I'm kind of calling this a rocker zone because it kind of rocks back and forth from side to side, and I think it'll take away some of the like extra running that would be involved, especially from the disc containing positions. So with this, you have your mark, and your mark's always going to be the mark, and they kind of cover the middle area of the field. So they're always going to be forcing to the sideline, so they're on the middle field side of the disc, regardless of where that is. And the next positions we have are wings. Yes, so they have similar positions to the 2-1-2-2-1 I showed last time, but they're actually going to play back and forth with each other moving into the cup. So in this scenario here with the disc on this side, this player becomes part of the cup, and then this player would cover over the mid. And then the deeps, again, we have 2 deeps in here, so one's going to have each side. So they're expected to cover more distance along the sideline, but they don't necessarily have to cover the whole width of the field. Or another way you could play these is you could do like a 1-2-1-1, and you have a short deep, which kind of covers this first half here. And then your deep covers the deep side. So here we see the wing on the right side coming over to fill in the cup. And that means the one on the left has to take over more that mid position. And then your deeps can then adjust off of that as well. So we're covering the easier throwing options here. If they make this break pass laterally, it's not going to be a huge detriment to the team. And then a pass coming over here, both this player here and the deep player will both have a chance to have a play on that. So something that kind of fills in the holes a bit quicker. So what happens with that if the disc moves to the other side of the field? So the mark stays in the middle, and then who was then mid there comes filling in, while the previous other member of the cup fills back into that mid spot, and then the deeps kind of rotate their space as well. So it's kind of rocking back and forth from side to side in those mid and deep positions there. So it's kind of less area to cover. The holes fill in a bit faster than if you were to just do a cup forcing one sideline running back and forth all the time. So another option to try out if you've been playing with a bit of zone in your 5-on-5. And then 4-on-4 here. So we're going to be losing one of our deep players with this, but it kind of plays similar to that rocker. So it's going to set up more of a diamond shape. And then you have your 2 mids there. Depending on what side you're in, you're kind of helping guard the disc a bit more. And then if it's on the opposite side of you, you cover the middle ground a bit more depending on where the players are. So there's just a couple different options you can play around with zone. Again, with 4 and 4, you have even fewer players on the field. So for like the indoor 4 and 4 that we play on those tiny fields, it can work really well. And I've played it against teams that have technically stronger overall players than I've played or coached with, and we've been able to like put on good runs against them because it's a different look. But against a big field, it's a lot of space to cover. So the offense kind of has a pretty big advantage there.
So the rocker idea is that as the mark, you're essentially forcing away from where the throw came from, so that they can't just keep swinging the disc back and forth because you're always in between.
Yeah, it's always going to be a break throw. And then it also just minimizes the amount of space you have to cover. So you're kind of only covering this space here instead of like always having to be on the right side of the thrower. Then it's kind of really reducing that space because you're just pushing to the outside, and you can kind of take a slower path to that. So
it's almost the opposite of forcing middle, you're forcing outside.
Yeah, forcing outsides, yeah. So like as the disc goes over, as that thrower, like you can take your time getting there and just making sure that you're staying in that line between this other handler there. So you don't need to sprint back and forth and back and forth. You're kind of letting this out, and this player has like a shorter path to get to as well to like cut this off. So yeah, it's kind of designed to have a bit less sprinting around chasing in the field and more containing and people being in those closer positions. Yeah. Any other questions about those?
I'll just mention that basically the fewer people on the field, the tougher it is to play zone.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So.
All right, Ali, you want to go do some offense now?
Yes, let's jump to offense.
So before we jump in there, I guess the kind of big takeaway for folks is that unlike a person defense where you can just focus on the person and just like be where they are, there's a little bit more mental effort in watching your teammates, watching the people coming into your zone. So you're, I guess, the kind of mental process is you're adapting to see which gaps you can fill, right, to help the rest of your team, but then also watching for the players that are coming into your area, whether it's like moving from handler to handler as the cup, or players running into your mid area. So it's just a little bit more challenging, I guess, but that's where the communication comes in to help with that.
Mm-hmm. Switching is a bit of an equalizer for the defense. Usually the offense has an advantage. Switching is sort of the equalizer for the D. The downside is that it's really difficult to do well over and over again because it takes a ton of communication and awareness.
And I think even if, like, I know we'd mentioned windy days and then maybe a physically stronger team or a faster team, but I know one of the things that Greg mentioned in his defensive clinic was just that idea of putting on something different as the defense just to rattle the other team, because now they've got to regroup and figure out how to work against this. So you may not spend a whole game doing zone defense, but if you just throw it on once or twice, that might be enough to kind of surprise the other team. Plus you get practice.
Yeah, you don't need to play it like the whole point either. Like if you have a team that has some really efficient plays off of a pull, play a zone for like 3 passes, and then you transition into like a matchup defense. Or kind of on the opposite end of that, if you have a team that's like really good at isolating that player, a lot of the idea with zones is people just assume that you like transition back into a matchup defense at the end. But I've seen some like really strong teams just play a zone right into the end zone. And it really messes with the other team's system for how they run their end zone, because they're used to people just having to beat that one player instead of having to like deal with the space they're running to. There's already someone standing there. So it's kind of gives them like different looks to have to adjust to on the fly. So yeah. All right. Do I want to talk about some offense now?
Okay, let's go to offense now. Okay, so the general approach for any offense up against a zone, sort of once you've figured out that the defense is playing zone on you, you're like, what the heck's going on? Oh, it's a zone. You want to sort of test the zone, probe it to see how it works, where the weaknesses might be. And I like to encourage people to go in this order of sort of probing. The first thing you're going to want to do is move the disc around the cup, so side to side, to see how the cup adjusts in its shape. If maybe sometimes it'll expand. If it expands, that gives room to move the disc inside of it. If it just spreads out, that'll open up gaps to throw the disc through the cup. And then there's always, of course, the option of going over the cup, which is typically the riskiest, but can also be quite rewarding. If you can just completely break, we call them zone breakers, when you throw over the cup to a really open person and basically forces the other team to get out of the zone altogether. So what I want to say to teams about this is to be patient. And when you're playing against a zone, you don't need to try and score as fast as you can necessarily. It's effective to do this testing to see how it reacts. Also, it has the defense run around a bunch, starts to tire them out, wear them down. That might not show dividends necessarily in that point, but throughout a game, wearing down the defense will pay off later on in the game. Okay, so when we're, in terms of terminology, once you get it past the cup, I call that the second level. So when you have the disc with the handlers, you're playing at a bit of a slower pace. You're doing this testing, this probing. Then once you get it past the cup, you want to basically run and gun, try and gain as many yards as you can. You've got a mismatch now. You're sort of overloading the defenders. You got more players. So you want to gain as many yards as you can. And then once the pace starts to slow down, you can't find an option, that's the time to find a handler again and reset and get the handlers moving the disc. A couple notes in terms of best practices for working in that second level is that it is much harder to complete a pass when you're throwing to someone running away from you, particularly if it's windy conditions, with the disc bouncing up and down. If you're the cutter and you can be running towards the thrower, it's really what you want to be doing. So what that means is that sometimes you'll have to spend a few seconds setting up your cut before you'd actually get it. So you need to sort of anticipate well in advance of what's going to be happening. And then once you get it into the second level there, you want to be, because you have a numbers advantage, you want to overload defenders. And I've got a slide to show a bit more about what I mean by that. You want to be spaced out enough and still making your cuts towards the disc, but be spaced out enough that the defender isn't covering you both just by standing there, that he or she is basically not covering anybody until they pick one, and then you throw to the other one. And one way to get the defender to commit sooner, it's always good, the sooner they commit, the sooner you can make the pass to the other person, is by throwing a fake. That sometimes gets them to bite towards that cutter, and then you can throw to the other one. And then with that, I think we're going to hand it over back to Jenn. Go over zone offense with 3 handlers in the backfield, and then I will talk about a zone offense with 4 handlers in the backfield.
Zone defense, you're kind of set with like a forced sideline zone or a forced middle zone. With this one, you can kind of take bits and pieces of like the different types of offenses we show you and just plug in what works for you or what you want to try out with your team. So I'm going to talk about a 3-handler approach to this. And the reason I kind of like this one is I find it's something that transitions a bit more easily, especially if you have some newer players on your team. It's something that's not going to be like you need to move drastically from your position where you originally were. So with this, we have 3 handlers. We have someone that we're going to be calling a popper for this position. So these are midfield offensive players and 2 wings. And then we have our deep player. So that's the terminology we're going to use for this. So if we're in a horizontal stack and we come out and we realize, oh, the other team's playing a zone against us, it's actually a really easy transition here. All we have is our 2 middle cutters in that stack. One of them takes the short position in the popper and the other one goes deep. And then we're in our zone offense. Similarly, vertical. So some teams will play a vertical stack with 3 handlers. If that's the case, great, you already have your 3 handlers out. If you don't, that first person in the stack just fills in that handler role. Your deep's already there. Your 2 people in that 3rd and 4th position can fill in the wings. And then who was originally in the 2nd position just fills in that popper. So it's not a lot of movement from a standard horizontal or vertical stack to get into those zone offenses. If you're playing some sort of isolation or a side stack thing, it's going to be a bit more movement to get there. But for these, which are pretty common in league, you have a bit more, it's a bit easier to transition between them. All right. So with our handlers, so we know from this defense, so I'm showing it against a cup, this offense will work against any type of zone. But in this position, we know the cup's trying to funnel you to that 4-side sideline here, right? So as handlers, when we see a zone come out, we should have the ability to recognize that it is a zone and where they're trying to force us. And if that's the case, we want to try to do our best to avoid going there. You don't want to really put yourself in a position of getting trapped and not gaining anything in the sideline. So basically, that's a lot of words of saying, like, don't stand on the sideline and take a lateral pass there. Bad idea. When I'm in that position, I like to just move upfield and sit just off of the tail of the cup. When I'm doing this, I'm kind of like walking around, seeing how they're reacting. So I'm making the tail think about their position. So if I am here, can I like pull them to the sideline enough that I open up a hole here for my teammates? Or can I move upfield enough and still get a pass that I get that pass beyond the cup and have the whole field downfield to continue on with my teammates? Or can I pull that tail out of the way enough that I make space for this other handler to move into the cup? In general, when I play zone offense, I try to avoid the whole dump and swing the disc from one side of the field and over back and forth and back and forth. I find in general, you're making a lot of passes and you're not really gaining a lot of yards from all those passes. And if you make a mistake in them, the other team's in a really easy transition spot because they have 3 players guarding the disc. So then they now have 3 players downfield against your 1 or maybe 2. So with this, I like to do a bunch of short passes, higher completion rate, keep the stall count low. And then once you are able to break through that cup, you can move, as Al said, move quickly and try and advance the disc downfield until you get to a position where you don't have an easy option again. Like the handlers catch back up and restart where you were from the beginning. So I kind of briefly mentioned crashing. Crashing into the cup can happen with your handlers or your popper. It's really important to keep the cup moving and to give you resetting options with the disc. So what should you think of when you're crashing into the cup? 1, be loud. Let the defense know you're there and let your teammates know you're there. So if you don't get the disc, whichever player in the cup is designated to cover the crash is probably going to react to you. But if you run, say it's the tail designated, and you run through this hole here, if you run through there going, yeah, these players are going to move a bit too. Whether they like intended to or not, they're just going to react to that noise a bit. So that'll give the thrower an option to maybe find another hole or another player open there. With your crashes, look to get yourself in a good position. So in general, if we can gain yards upfield or to the break side, that's going to be more beneficial to the team. And then use your momentum with those crashes. So if you're going in there at high speed and you catch the disc, you can take this as many steps as you need to slow down. You don't need to like risk your knees to stop as fast as possible. So if you're going into the cup at this angle, you catch a pass here, and then it takes you a few steps to slow down. That means the cup has to move and adjust to that position there. So a lot of times it's like, oh, I need to stop on that first foot that plants on the ground. Stop quickly, but you can take it a step or two. And if you're taking that step or two, take it on the same line you caught the disc and gain some yards if you can. All right, so there's just a couple different angles to get into crash the cup. Where are we going? Here. So one I like a lot, if you're in that, either handler can be in that position, but setting up right behind the disc and just taking a couple steps forward to crash into that line there. You're not necessarily making a hole in the cup, but you're getting yourself a new stall count. If one of these players peels off to cover you, then that's only 2 players covering the disc instead of 1. So the rest of your team has more of an option to look for downfield. So that's just an easy way to reset that I like to use a lot. Okay, so our popper. So what this popper's primary goal is to look for holes through the cup or passes over the top of the cup. So they kind of sit right in behind there. It's a lot of like lateral movement back and forth over like small distances, kind of standing still, stopping in weird places, like everything that would drive you nuts in a person defense and your teammates would yell at you for, you want to do when you're in that popper position. One thing I really like to do as a popper is if the disc is moving and the cup's moving, finding that little second to move against the direction that the cup is moving is a chance to find holes. So kind of seeing if it goes to the break side here, as the cup's going there, you can make that little move back and towards the force side there, and you might be able to find a hole through the cup or just off the tail of it, where you can get the disc there, and then you have the upfield to look at as well. As I mentioned before, as a popper, you can also crash into the cup. I try to avoid it unless it's like a high stall count scenario and I know no one else is around for a couple reasons. Primarily it being when you're crashing into the cup from the popper position, you're then catching the disc with your momentum going backfield and you're back to the downfield. So aside from like a quick flip back to the original thrower, you're not really doing much that's going to be helping your team overall in a lower stall count scenario. So I tend to kind of just hang out behind the cup, trying to find those holes through it there. All right, our next position, we have our wings. So wings are kind of looking for either that second pass through the cup. So popper gets it or one of your handler gets it through the cup and your wings are looking for those second passes there. Or they're looking for those over the top passes. So something like a hammer, a bladey flick getting there. So it's a lot of relying on being in a big open space, which can feel, again, counterproductive to what you're told when you're cutting a lot of times. If you're in those wing positions and you have like a 10-yard by 10-yard box and there's no defender there, you're in a good spot and you can just kind of stand still there. But then again, when it gets through, that timing is really important in those wing positions. It's like you're open for a second, but then you're not anymore. So it's a position that's kind of hard to play, but it's also hard to do wrong in. So a lot of people throw their newer players there because they can't really do anything that will mess things up for them, but it can also be really frustrating for those players because that timing is so important there and they don't touch the disc a lot that they might just be standing around and not feel engaged in the play. So think about it when you're assigning like roles for your league team of what positions you put them in. Yeah, try them out, but maybe have them try those popper positions or maybe be one of the other handlers too, just to keep people engaged in playing there. With those like open spaces you can find as wings, throwing hammers, blades, stuff like that in windy conditions is totally fine. Just practice it and make sure your teammates practice catching them. So if you throw a hammer at someone who's never seen it before, it's probably not going to be completed. But if you practice those, maybe throw a few in the warm-up and you know your teammates can catch it, it's not that high risk of a throw. It could be like a huge impact for your team because if you are able to throw from here over here, you're getting by 6 defenders. So you're going to be at a huge advantage there if you can complete that throw consistently.
Would it be safe to say, like, say you had the team had just played really, really hard defense, you're really tired and you're sort of not ready to be a popper or a handler, that's kind of a good position to like volunteer for, to just rest a bit, and then it's about watching and waiting, and as opposed to cutting a lot.
Oh, for sure. Yeah. Like, provided you don't get to the point where the disc gets so close to you that you're kind of in the way of the handlers and poppers, it's definitely a good resting position for your teammates. So if you have that like player that is trying on offense and cutting a bit, but they don't have the endurance to go for a long time, that might be a good position to put them in against a zone, to be like, okay, you only need to cut here on these like once every 10 seconds. And if you miss it, it's not a huge deal. So that might be something for a person who likes that more. But if you have that runner on your team that likes to run a lot, they're probably not going to be enjoying themselves so much in those positions. With the wings and the deep, we'll talk about later, those are all interchangeable. So if you're in that wing position here, and let's say the disc gets to this player here, feel free to strike deep. Like, you have those options to move back and forth. I know some people will set them all up in like one roll in a zone, and just have it kind of working as a triangle back and forth. I like to just separate them because I find it's a little easier for newer players to just have that one position they go into. So this player may go deep. If they don't get it, they can come back instead of then having to worry about the deep position there. And then kind of as Alain talked about through there as well, if you catch the disc in the position, you want to keep moving it quickly to those high percentage throws you know you can make. If you don't see one of those, your handlers will catch up, and then you have like a 5-foot pass back to them, move up field and continue on from there. And then the last, so there's just an example of like what some wing movement would look like. If the disc goes to your side, you're kind of looking to maybe take a couple of steps out and then come in one of the holes on either side of the mid. And then if you're in the opposite side, you can look to cut deep, or you can also look to cut into the middle of the field here. All right, and then finally the deep. So for the deep, you're in a similar situation to the wings, is like you get that second pass, maybe that third pass, that when the disc goes through the cup, but also being ready for that huck deep if the defender's not paying attention to you. So as Alain mentioned, if you're playing deep on defense, like one of your biggest goals is talking to your teammates, right? So if I'm playing deep on offense, I'm going to do the best I can to make sure this player has to pay attention to me and can't pay attention to what's happening otherwise in the field. I like to set up just like this player is here, like right in their blind spot. So they kind of have to walk, keep an eye on me, see what's happening behind them all the time. And they may miss what my wings and poppers are doing up front, and they aren't able to tell their defenders, like, tell their other defenders about that. Like we mentioned, the fewer numbers you have on the field, the more advantage the offense has. So if I can take this deep out of the play and say we're playing 6-on-6 instead of 7-on-7, that's an advantage for my team. So something you can look at there. Again, you can kind of move into that wing space as well. So if the disc goes to a sideline, if you want to go look for a continuation pass under, you can do that. Or if it's going to the opposite side of the field view, you can cut deep off of that as well. So as a deep, you have loads of space to play with. And again, it can be that kind of resting space too. With the wings, it's just, you may get yourself in a position where you're resting and taking away a deep cut from your wings. But again, if the thrower recognizes that and doesn't throw the pass, then it's not going to hurt you as much. So just to say, yeah, some examples of wings moving there. So we had talked about setting sideline traps on offense or on defense. So as the offense, I know everyone's going to do a really, really good job and never pass to their teammates that are sitting right on the sideline, but you may have like gotten a D and knocked the disc at the sideline, so you have to put it into play there, things like that. There's going to be scenarios where you end up on that sideline. So how do we want to get out of that? We want to talk about. So with that, like I talked about before, crashing is really important there. And with this, the timing is really important of those crashes. So a lot of times the first person in the cup may not get the disc, but the reaction to what the defenders do when you go into that cup for like your other handlers and poppers and potentially wings is how you're going to get the disc off the sideline there. With your backfield, so your wings and your deep, when there is a trap on the sideline, you want to be really careful to not get too close. So you want to do your best to try and keep these mids paying enough attention to you. If this player here was here, that means that their defender's also there, and now you have 6-7 people in this like small box that they're trying to get a pass off there. So the more people in an area, the harder it is to complete a pass. So if you're in those wings in deep position there, you want to keep spread out as much as possible. So for example, here, this wing has all this space here that if this player can throw something over the top, they have a fair bit of time to get to the disc without ideally the defender getting there. Similarly with the deep, they're pulling this deep player out of the play a bit. So now that we have our wings in our deep giving us some space, you want probably one of these two people to look to crash into the cup first, and then whichever one of them doesn't get there, you would then, so if say this person crashes first, you could have the popper or your other handler looking to move in off of that. If this player goes in first, then your second crash is probably going to be from here, and then this is going to be your next pass. So just an example of what one could look like. So your first handler goes in, they don't get it, but they make a hole, maybe the mark reacts a little bit that way, so then they can get it off the line. Here we're still on the sideline, but we've gotten past the cup. So we want to look to continue the disc towards the middle of the field. So because we have our first handlers kind of in an odd spot here, this popper can actually come out and fill in there. And now, because there were so many defenders on this side, this wing has loads of space to work with. So they can look to fill in either side here and just continue around. And then we could continue there that the deep player could fill in. We could have this wing here look to the middle, or one of the handlers here could fill in spaces in the middle. So just going back through that there. So first player goes into the cup. As that happens, the other player moves to the backfield, and then you go around from there. So just one option there, and then there's many different options you can have of any of those handlers, poppers moving into the cup. If they can get it for a reset of the stall count, that's great. If not, you want to look to find a hole in the cup, either throwing backwards or through one of the holes from one of your other handlers or poppers. So you kind of get pretty close here. Like if we look here, we have handler, 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 popper of our original group there. So everyone's pretty close to that sideline to get it off. Once you get it off, you can spread back out a bit more again. Cool. All right, Al, did you want to talk a bit more about offense there?
Okie doke.
Okay.
I'm going to talk about a slightly different setup where we have 4 handlers instead of the 3 that Jen went over, which is I would say the more traditional approach with the 3 handlers. So just visually to see, we're bringing one of the wings down. We have 4 handlers now. The 2 on the edges are essentially sort of a hybrid handler wing position. We've got a popper. Sorry. This one person in this setup we would call a topper, or I guess a wing we could call them, and then the deep. Just to talk a little bit about generally about zones, just to explicitly state it, given like the sideline trap talk that we've been going over and stuff, the side we want to get the disc on is the we call it the uphill side, which is basically upwind. So if that's the top of the screen here, that would mean the wind is blowing down the screen. And the reason why we want to get the disc there before we move it down the field is to take advantage of the wind blowing in that direction, to get us a few more yards and keep the disc in the field, rather than if we were, say, had the disc on this sideline and we throw it with a crosswind, our disc is going out of bounds pretty quickly. We want to move it uphill and then start moving it down the field if we can. So here's an example of getting the disc, moving the disc around the cup in a 4-handler situation. This type of move will look familiar to people who were who have watched the reset chat. Going behind the disc like that, behind the thrower, getting the disc and moving it to the wing, and trying to gain yards. Maybe this person's continuing up and getting another pass back up here and trying to gain yards up here. Similar to what Jen was talking about crashing, and the specific crash that she was preferential to, the one that starts back here and goes this way into the wind and gaining those lateral yards and a few vertical yards as well. I call that a chisel, a specific type of crash where you're starting from behind and you're going diagonally. Thrower just sort of floats the pass into this space here where it's away from the defenders. The player catches it, lands, and takes a few steps. Maybe they'll get all the way through the cup. Maybe maybe they won't, but maybe they'll be able to throw it through the cup still from there. Here's an example of a chisel fake. So maybe you've done a couple chisels, the cup is catching on, they're starting to jump those passes. So you're gonna fake one. And what's gonna happen is the defender is still gonna go with that person who he thinks is getting the disc, and it's gonna open up a bit of a hole that you can then throw to the popper. And then let's talk about continuations. So here we have the topper now, whose responsibility it is, along with the deep, to provide continuation cuts in that second level. Once the popper gets it, this topper is coming across for a pass. And we talk about overloading in the second level here. Let's look at this. We're going to split this defender. If this defender goes with that person, then it opens up this area here where the hybrid handler wing can move up and get a pass there. If that defender goes with them. Here's a situation in which the defense shifted a bit differently. So that mid took that topper coming across, and now this person's covered too. So this is just showing again how covering the disc last when you're on D can really help sort of nullify the overload advantage that the offense has in that second level and contain. Here, zone breakers are going over the cup, which the topper is looking to find those spaces in anywhere sort of in this range. Usually there's big gaps that open up there where they can be running into one or sit in one and have a strong handler comfortable with hammers and blades and things. Throw it to them. So in this case, the defender down here is maybe starting to cheat into that wing handler, just makes that big gap even bigger for that topper to run into. Like Jen was saying, I like to have the deep and the topper be interchangeable. It just provides a bit more dynamic play and forces the defense to do more switching, which is usually where communication breaks down and you get someone who's wide open because someone forgot to do part of the switch or something like that. So maybe the deep is running into that big gap and then overloading deep defender with the topper running deep, and they have to choose which one to go with, leaving somebody wide open. And I did want to mention too, sort of some of the benefits of the four handler zone it allows for the handlers to be more aggressive generally in attacking up the field. With the chisels, basically the chisel will take that one handler out of the play if they don't get it, but two handlers are still there to provide other options if that happens. So it gives a bit more wiggle room and aggressiveness for those handlers. So it's well suited to teams that do have several strong handlers so that they can fill those 4 spots with people who are comfortable handling. And the way it helps with the sideline trap as well, where that 4th person is sort of already back rather than needing to rely on the popper to go back there necessarily. So again, you're crashing the cup as Jenn had showed. This person's already standing behind the disc and can move it to that far side. Maybe you're getting trapped and that person standing behind is getting covered, in which case this really shows how much more difficult getting out of this is and why you don't want to get on that sideline, because especially if that person isn't the strongest thrower, this is going to be a bit of a nightmare. So that's why we always want to be moving uphill away from the force. But in this case, you might want to crash up, into there. If the defender goes with you, then this person can come back into this space. And if the defender stays there, then hopefully you're creating some gaps in the cup where you can get an easy reset just to that person.
So Al, those 4 handlers are kind of like cycling through the different positions. So there isn't really like a fixed handlers in the middle and handlers on the side. You're sort of cutting in triangles, trying to get, right, like weaving in between to get to the open spot.
Yeah, well, you could play both ways. You could play where the wing handlers are fairly strict about staying on the side there, even though they may make some slashes and things. Effect, they will be returning there and keeping the 2 in the middle. And I've also seen where they interchange almost completely, like doesn't matter who's where.
So in the wing scenario, like, I mean, often you can get 4 people to volunteer and handle, but then there's always like different levels of comfort, right? So if you've got some newer handlers or you're trying to introduce people into the handler role, would they be better off in the kind of wing positions versus the middle, or does it really matter?
I would say the ones on the wings are the ones you want who are good spatially and with like finding open spaces with their legs. And the ones in the middle, these are the 2 in the middle are going to be the ones who are chiseling more often. So in that sense, it's a bit more of a specific role that might be easier to learn for newer people. You just have to focus on sort of that. So it might actually be easier to start out as sort of one of the middle handlers with someone who's a stronger thrower.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Any other questions before I go to the 5-on-5 version?
Nope, I think we're good.
Okay, let me flip through here. So in the 5-on-5 version of this, basically you're keeping the 2 middle handlers, the popper, and then the wing handlers are also taking on the responsibilities of the deep as well. So they're really sort of have a lot to cover, space to cover. The way it would work is that the side that the disc is on, the wing is going to be more of a handler, and when it's on the offside, it's going to be more of a deep cutter and piston back and forth. So it's quite a bit of running around for those people. And again, in the 4-on-4 variation, we want to keep sort of that triangle to work with, and have the one player roam around and provide the continuation passes once these two handlers get it to the second level. Jenn, did you want to show your offenses as well?
For 4 and 4 and 5 and 5. So kind of the same idea as Al's. So he had the wings kind of becoming wing deep hybrid. So I'm taking away the popper here. So our wings kind of become wing popper hybrids. So say the disc is on this side, the person on the same side might look for the continuation here, where this player can look to fill into the middle, kind of the holes between or over top of the two-person cup there. And then the handlers are kind of the same, close to each other, close to the middle. And then the deep position kind of stays the same. So again, like just take out a name somewhere, and then you kind of have to cover what role they had previously with another player and just kind of fill those in there. But in general, like these four are kind of the super active people in that. And then this player's keeping the deep occupied or looking for the deep throws. So again, there could be another option of movement on there. So if the disc goes to that sideline, this player could be a deep option as well. And then the hybrid on this side could fill in either side of this defensive player here. And then 4 and 4. When I'm playing 4 and 4, I kind of like to eliminate role titles. So there's no handlers, no cutters. It's just a lot more fluid with that. With 4 and 4, you definitely want to be take into consideration who's picking up the disc, especially if it's on a sideline. So if the defense is trapping, you want someone that's comfortable making those break throws. But with 4 and 4 there, I find you can just have the other 3 players kind of look to fill in the deep side, the open side, and the break side, and just have someone always in those positions. So say the disc is coming into play here, this player here can look to fill in holes there. This player here has crashing options coming through here, or looking for something over the top there. This player can kind of sit in this space to look for an over the top throw or look to go deep. You have different options like that. If this player maybe fills up there, this player could then come back and fill in that handler space, even though they may not be designated as a handler usually. So if I'm in 4 and 4, you try and be a lot more flexible as to what your role is on the field, and more just look to find that open space things, which is great for other players because there's only 3 people that you can pass to. So everyone's ideally getting more chances to touch the disc.
So just to clarify the last slide, I think it was still showing 5 defenders. So one of those back people would just be like a single deep kind of in a zone scenario.
Yeah. So the zone I showed for 4 and 4 was like a diamond. So we'll just take one of those players out there. But I don't know, I was imagining these 4 offensive players doing such a good job that it didn't matter they were playing against 5 defenders. Yeah, so in that case, yeah, this space would be way more open there for them to use. But yeah. Any questions? Al, do you have anything to add?
I did want to add one thing about zone defense. And that was just a bit of a comment about what's like a victory for the defense, because you can get scored on and still, have a win sort of for the D if you're really making the defense throw a lot of passes and you come close to a D, maybe the offense gets lucky, quote unquote lucky, completing a few low percentage passes. Those are wins for the defense, even though they may have completed them in that case, because over time those aren't going to work every time. And so I just wanted to mention, the concept of a win on D isn't necessarily all about the score.
So I had a couple of questions, I think, since we were talking about defense. So if you're throwing on your zone defense, the other team comes out and then reacts with either a 3-handler scenario or a 4-handler scenario. Would you choose a different style of zone to adapt to 4 handlers versus 3 handlers? Is there one matchup that works particularly well?
I think it kind of depends a lot on like how you run your 3 handlers, how you run your 4 handlers. Like your zones can be effective against them. So for example, if you're playing like a cup versus 4 handlers, that means there's only 3 people downfield to cover with your 3 mids and your deep. So it just gives a bit more leeway for those, maybe your 4 side mid or your break side mid, depending on where the disc is, to kind of poach up into that handler space, and they can help cover that 3rd or 4th handler a bit more. Where if you have 3 handlers and 4 people downfield, it's more of a 1-to-1 ratio of defenders downfield versus offensive players downfield. So it's just I think just taking liberty in what your role is to react to what the offense does. So reminding yourself that you're not stuck in this like set box on the field. If there's no one in your zone to cover, you find someone to cover and react to it that way.
Does the force like a sideline versus the force middle, like does that affect depending on how many handlers there are? Or is that just more a personal preference of the team and what works for the skill sets of the team?
I think it's like what you want to take away with that, right? So with the force middle, a lot of times you're taking away those like the hooks are a lot harder to read because of how it's set up. I'm trying to like think of how to word this. But yeah, it's kind of one of those like they have to be a lot more bladier and take like curvier paths to get where you want to go with the zone where you're kind of in the middle. Versus something on the sideline where if you pass far away enough that you can get that throw off before the cup gets there, you can throw those flatter throws, or if you can throw the cross-field throws, those are definitely options with you there. So it's like each zone takes away different things, but also each zone leaves different things open. So I would say like if you try like a cup against whatever offense they throw at you and it does not work at all, try a different zone and just see how they react to it.
One rule of thumb that I've heard, I don't know how accurate this is, but is basically to find a mismatch. So if the defense has a 3-person cup, to go with 4 handlers, and then if they have a 4-person cup, then maybe use 3 handlers and find the mismatch. There'll be a mismatch somewhere, and exploit that when you get the disc there.
And then I guess it's also watching. I think a lot of it is the being willing to adapt, right? Like it's very easy to go, I learned zone this way, I was taught, right? And it's the only way I know how to play, and then be really stuck. And then you meet a team that all their strengths happen to be the things that you're letting them have, and then it doesn't work. So to be having that willingness to change, and even put different people in different positions, regardless of their level of experience, to just kind of change things up is often the most helpful. I have a couple of other questions about, so what if you don't have enough handlers? So we're sort of assuming there's 3 handlers there to at least play the 3-handler version. So what if you have sort of 2 reluctant handlers and maybe not even a 3rd person who really wants to be a handler? How can you adapt the zone, or what's the best way to kind of meet that challenge? Or just put people in position, just do it.
Trying is definitely go ahead, Al.
I was gonna say I would put your strongest handler on like the trap sideline side, potentially, so that if the disc does go there, you can get it out of there. I mean, there's only so much you can do because you need people to be throwing the disc. So, and you can't only do it with 1 or 2 people. So they'll have to get in there at some point and start figuring it out.
I think like just setting that tone on your team too is helpful. So maybe not the first day you play zone is like other people need to handle, but maybe like from the first couple of days, it's like, okay, everyone's going to try out handling. So if you have 2 comfortable handlers, maybe that 3rd person is someone different every point. So they get a little more experience with it each time. And then maybe another time it's like, it's 1 comfortable handler and 2 people who maybe weren't as comfortable before, but are more comfortable now. I've also run a zone with 2 handlers, and then instead of having 1 popper, you have 2 poppers. So if that word handler is intimidating to them, say you're a popper where basically you have the same role, you play in the same space, You just don't have that same title with it. So I mean, a lot of times just putting a different word on things makes people like more comfortable with it, right? So
And
give
I
it a
like
shot that way.
Al, where you mentioned like that chisel position, because that's a very easy to understand specific task, and you're not being asked to throw a long distance or a difficult throw over a cup. So then it's again a kind of position where it's this, you know, if you're like, I'm not a strong thrower, I'm not a strong thrower, it's like, but you could probably throw 10 feet in front of you, right, to somebody who's cutting right beside you. So, you know, then it builds the confidence to maybe take on some of the other positions.
You definitely don't become a strong thrower by not throwing.
Yeah. And then just a reminder to the folks, because I also have one last question, that the survey. So to help us kind of put on more programming in the future, please click on the link and fill out the survey. It's always nice to see where people are tuning in from, if they're local or from out of town, and then also what other topics you want to hear in the future. But one last question on my end. So when you have all your diagrams, you've kind of got the defender shown at an angle. So if you are newer to a mid position, especially when you're on the wings on the sides, and we had already discussed a little bit about how you're kind of got one eye on what's going on in the cup, you've got one eye on who's cutting in from behind. What's the best kind of body position to set? Because obviously if your back is to the end of the field, you don't see anyone coming from behind, or if you flipped around the other way, you don't see what's going on at the cup.
The like awkward, who's gonna answer? Al, do you want to answer? I did two already.
Oh, okay. Well, when I think of playing defense in a zone, I'm moving all the time, sort of repositioning, moving, looking around all the time, and moving my body around all the time too. So I don't have a straight
I guess
good
it's
answer
like I've
for
heard
that.
like some folks has like been, you know, when you're new and it's just like, okay, whatever you do, like, or have your back to the end zone or something, or no, to the sideline, so that
I
you
guess
can
as a
roll your
rule of
hand.
thumb, I would say put yourself in a position where you can, where the disc is most likely to go, or like where you're trying to cover. Put yourself in a position where you can sprint into that space most quickly. And then the optimization is like doing that while also trying to position yourself so you can see as much of the field.
Okay.
You're going to be out of position a lot, and then you figure that out by being out of position and you adjust the next time.
Yeah. Or hopefully have that sideline person shouting at you, turn around, look, look, look.
And I guess there's one thing I just want to make very clear that is really important when you're playing defense in a zone, and that's to be in front of the person you're covering, which means between them and the disc. If you're on the other side of them, you're not covering them. So, and more to that, you're not shutting it down, meaning like the thrower is looking at that and thinking they can make that pass. So really important to be on the underside of them. In the mid, we're talking about the mids mostly here, but yeah, that's what I consider to be like covered.
If you're covering a popper, at what point should you kind of back off? Like if they're about to approach the cup, you don't necessarily want to be so in the cup that now you're out of position to cover any other cutters in your zone. Like what's a kind of good spot to let go and drop back?
That's one where like that communication is really important. So if you're playing, say you're in that mid position, you were guarding someone who's kind of in that popper role and they're getting up close to the cup, talk to the cup. Be like whoever's in the tail, like, hey Vicky, turn around, you got someone on your right. And then once you make that communication, you can look and back off. It's one to like, if you get to the point where you're overloaded that there's so many people in that area that your like left and right wings can't help you out either, then where's the bigger threat? Is that popper the person that's getting the disc every second time and really helping the offense flow them through? Maybe stick with them a little longer. But if you have a thrower that keeps hitting those players like 15, 20 yards down the field, that's going to hurt your defense a lot more. So you might want to drop off a bit earlier. So it's another situation where like they're probably, a good thrower is going to beat you regardless of what decision you make, but try and make them beat you in different ways each time and adjust to it from there.
In a zone, I'm really not concerned about 2, 3, 4 yard gaining passes, because that, you know, the offense will need to throw 50, 100 passes before they get to the end zone. But if, like Jen was saying, if there's no one else to cover in the zone, stay on them, as long as they're not pulling you too far out. And if there's someone else more important to cover, then you say, no, 5-yard pass versus 15-yard pass.
And I think that's an important comment, is that it's really zone. It's like a waiting game as a defense, right? Like you're trying to make your opponents throw so many passes that just one is not going to work out. And, and to just kind of like make that happen. So those short passes, it's a little bit different than when you're kind of person where it's like, okay, it's so easy to flow it down the field. Whereas here it's just like a game of probability.
Yes.
It really is, yeah.
I know one thing kind of on the offensive side that happens a lot with that, with the thought of like, okay, we got through the cup, we have to go quick. If you have some players downfield, like make sure they know it's okay to like not force a pass they don't have. So if your wing gets it and they see someone cutting deep to the end zone that's wide open, but it's 40 yards away and they can only throw like a 20-yard back hit, it's totally fine for you to just turn around and throw that like 3-foot pass back to your handler again, right? Because it is such a big opportunity on both sides. So on offense, you're like resetting. Okay, finally we get through the cup. You don't want to then have to play defense right after that. So just that, like, it's the excitement of, okay, it's going really well. We're gaining yards, but also recognition of, okay, where's my throwing capability? And especially where's my throwing capability in this like wind or rain or whatever the weather's doing too, right? So recognizing these are your first options, but take a throw that you know you can complete.
That's a difficult lesson to get across often. And it kind of, it's a bit of a balancing act with the environment that I think every league team wants to have of encouraging people to find out where their boundaries are and to, maybe they don't know yet if they have a 40-yard throw or not. So once they figure that out, then yeah, it's time to cut it out.
And I think too, it's like being those handlers, it's like be there for the support, right? So if they turn around and there's no one there to help them out, then they're probably like, oh, I guess I have to throw it. No one's coming.
Yeah. My first year playing club, my coaches had a drill that they called the Jenn Beck drill. They didn't tell me until a few years later they called it the Jenn Beck drill, but I was really good at catching the disc like 10 yards outside of the end zone and then like freaking out and throwing it away. So just getting used to that, like, okay, there's no one there that I know I can make an easy pass to, and I'm just going to turn around and complete it, and then hopefully catch the next one in the end zone.
And often if you are so far ahead of everyone else, there's really no pressure because there's no one covering you. You can take a moment and just, just wait for everyone to catch.
It took me years, literally years, to train myself to look to my dump. Like I had to get people on the sideline and ask them to yell at me every time I got the disc to start looking for my dump, because otherwise I was just waiting forever trying to find,
like, so focused on upfield.
Yeah, trying to find an opportunity upfield, and it felt like a failure almost if I had to dump it. But so switching that mentality around how important it is to reset and how it's not a failure at all, it's actually turning it over as the failure, really.
Well, and I think this kind of back to your seminar about the resets, right? And like making the eye contact with that dump person, because like, I've also been in that behind position, and then you get see the person with the disc glance over their shoulder, kind of look at me for a second, but not engage in eye contact, and then it's like, but I'm still here, right? And then it's like, sometimes you get seen, but just still that mentality of wanting to throw upfield just overrides it, and it's a really hard thing to break. So yeah, I'm getting used to like locking eyes.
Yeah, takes some work.
Great. So this has been really fabulous, especially going into the fall season where, last fall we played in the snow. So I'm sure all these zone concepts are very, very useful, especially with those kind of conditions. So thanks again for taking the time and putting together a fabulous presentation. I know being the summer, it's always tough to get people listening live, but this will be online for forever for all of our future members and current members to kind of refresh and learn. So I'm really grateful for that. So thanks.
Cool. Thanks for having us.
And thank you everyone who tuned in live. See you soon.
Yeah.